The page wasn't supposed to matter. Not yet. It was buried inside a much larger palace plan, surrounded by renovation language, room allocations, ceremonial arrangements, public access schedules, staff movements, all the dull machinery that keeps a monarchy functioning without anybody outside the gates noticing. But William noticed one line. Then he read it again. Because if that line stayed exactly where it was, something connected to Queen Camilla wouldn't simply survive King Charles's reign. It could become part of the structure William inherited. And that was where everything changed. Not with shouting, not with a dramatic confrontation in some gilded corridor, with a refusal, a quiet one. The kind that becomes far more dangerous inside a palace because nobody knows how far it reaches until somebody tries to move past it. But here's the strange part. The plan William was looking at wasn't supposed to be controversial at all. It was supposed to solve problems. Instead, in this dramatized reconstruction, inspired by the publicly reported Buckingham Palace renovation plans, it creates one enormous question. Who gets to make decisions for the next reign before the next reign has even begun? Because William's problem wasn't necessarily what Camilla had been given. It was how permanent it looked. And when he realized that, the entire document suddenly stopped looking administrative. It started looking political. Now, one thing needs to be absolutely clear before we go deeper. There is no verified public evidence that William literally discovered a secret clause and blocked Camilla. The private conversations you're about to hear are dramatized, but the real backdrop is extraordinary enough on its own. Buckingham Palace is undergoing a massive resurfacing program costing hundreds of millions of pounds. The reported figure is £369 million. The work has been transforming plumbing, wiring, heating, infrastructure, and enormous sections of a building containing hundreds of rooms. But then came the decision that made people look at the palace very differently. Charles and Camilla reportedly do not intend to move into Buckingham Palace as their main home when the work is finished. They prefer Clarence House. Wait, a £369 million refurbishment, but the king doesn't intend to live there? That sounds strange until you understand what Buckingham Palace is becoming. Less family home, more headquarters. Ceremonies, audiences, state functions, receptions, tourism, offices, public access, a working machine wrapped inside one of the most recognizable buildings on Earth. And buried inside reports about that future was another detail. One room associated with the position of Queen Consort was reportedly being prepared for a defined purpose: the Consorts Library, a room connected historically to Prince Albert. The reported plan was for it to become an official audience room where Camilla could receive guests, while also serving educational purposes and being incorporated into palace tours. Perfectly reasonable. Except our dramatized scenario begins with one tiny addition appearing beneath that arrangement. Not a new sofa, not a portrait, not a decorative change, a wording change. The difference between saying the room would be used by Queen Camilla during the present reign, and language suggesting it could remain assigned to an office connected to her work beyond the circumstances that created it. William stops, reads it again, then asks the question nobody expected him to ask. Who approved the permanence? Silence. Because that word changes everything. A room is a room. An office is an office. But permanence? Permanence reaches into somebody else's reign. And suddenly, this isn't about Camilla anymore. It's about William. Imagine being handed a document describing how the building you may one day control is going to operate. Most of it makes sense. Tourists here. Staff there. Staterooms protected. Private spaces reduced. Ceremonial functions preserved. Then you reach one paragraph that appears to make a current arrangement harder for you to alter later. Would you sign it? William, in this scenario, doesn't. But he doesn't tear it up either. That would have been easier. He does something colder. He sends it back. One instruction. Remove the addition. Not reconsider, not review, remove. And that's when Camilla supposedly hears about it. But here's the twist. She doesn't immediately object. Which makes William more suspicious, not less. Because if the wording was insignificant, why had somebody inserted it? But if it mattered, why wasn't anyone fighting openly to preserve it? That's the first clue that this wasn't really about one room. The palace has always run on distinctions outsiders barely notice. Private versus official. Personal versus institutional. Temporary versus permanent. The crown versus the individual wearing it. Those words sound boring until one of them determines who still has access after a monarch dies. Then they become explosive. Charles became king in September 2022 after the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Camilla became Queen Consort, later commonly styled Queen Camilla. William became Prince of Wales. 3 titles changed almost instantly. But rooms don't move that quickly. Staff don't. Paperwork doesn't. Relationships definitely don't. The new reign inherited an enormous physical institution designed around the previous one. So Charles began shaping it around himself. That's normal. But eventually, every monarch encounters the same uncomfortable truth. Anything you build may be dismantled by your successor, unless you make it difficult. And that's the thought that supposedly catches William's attention. Not, what does Camilla want? Something much more dangerous. What am I being asked to inherit? There's a difference, a massive one, because William isn't just Charles's son. He is the next person in line to occupy the constitutional position his father holds now. That creates an unusual family relationship. You can disagree with your father as a son, but what happens when the disagreement concerns powers you may inherit from him as sovereign? Now the argument has 2 clocks running at once. The present and the future. Camilla, meanwhile, occupies an equally unusual position. She is Charles's wife. She has her own charities, patronages, staff, public duties, and institutional footprint. But she isn't the heir. That's William. Which means every long-term palace arrangement touching both households contains a question nobody enjoys saying aloud. What happens when Charles is no longer king? And this is where our dramatized document gets more uncomfortable. William asks who requested the extra wording. The answer isn't Camilla. Wait, what? That's what everybody would assume. But no. In this reconstruction, the wording comes through officials attempting to create continuity, administrative neatness, that's all. At least that's what William is told. The explanation sounds almost painfully reasonable. If a room has already been adapted for a particular function, why redesignate it later? If staff structures already exist, why dismantle them automatically? If a queen has projects and records associated with a palace office, why create chaos during a transition? Continuity prevents confusion. William listens, then asks another question. Continuity for how long? Nobody has a clean answer. And there it is, the trap hidden inside a sensible explanation. A temporary arrangement can become permanent simply because nobody chooses the moment to end it. 1 year becomes 3. 3 becomes 10. Then somebody points to precedent. That's how we've always done it. William knows how powerful those words can become, because monarchy runs on precedent. Some of it written, much of it not. Once something becomes normal, changing it can look personal, even when the original arrangement was never supposed to last forever. So the safest moment to draw a line isn't later. It's before the precedent begins. And suddenly the instruction to remove 1 sentence doesn't seem small anymore. It feels surgical. But Camilla still hasn't reacted. Not publicly, not dramatically, nothing. Then comes the detail that supposedly changes the temperature. Charles sees the revised version without the permanence language and sends a question back. Why was it removed? Now William has a choice. He could say the wording was unclear. He could blame drafting. He could call it an administrative concern. He doesn't. In our dramatized version, he answers with 6 words. The next reign must remain free. That's it. No accusation. No mention of Camilla. No attack. But everybody reading it understands exactly what it means. Charles's authority is complete while he is king. William isn't challenging that. He's refusing to allow decisions made under Charles to automatically bind William after Charles is gone. Which sounds obvious, until you remember their father and son, because Charles can hear something inside that sentence William never actually said. You don't decide what happens after you. And that lands differently, especially for a monarch who spent decades waiting to become king. Charles was heir for longer than any previous Prince of Wales. He spent much of his adult life preparing for a role occupied by his mother until she was 96 years old. He knows exactly what it feels like to have ideas about the future, but no authority to impose them yet. Now the roles are reversed. He is sovereign. William is waiting. But unlike Charles during much of his own apprenticeship, William is preparing for a monarchy facing different pressures: smaller public patience, bigger financial scrutiny, more questions about property, more questions about who gets what, more pressure to prove that royal buildings aren't simply enormous private houses maintained for privileged families, which is why the Buckingham Palace decision matters. Charles and Camilla remaining at Clarence House, while Buckingham Palace increasingly functions as a ceremonial, administrative, and visitor destination, changes what the building represents. It's becoming less about who sleeps there, more about who controls what happens there. And control is exactly where William becomes careful. Very careful. Because once you start assigning spaces, offices, roles, and privileges inside that structure, you aren't just decorating rooms. You're creating expectations. Now imagine the second draft arriving. The controversial wording is gone. Problem solved. Right? No. Because something else has appeared. Smaller. Almost invisible. A reference to associated support arrangements. William circles it. This is the moment where you almost hear the paper hit the desk. Because removing the room language while preserving whatever operational structure sat behind it would achieve nearly the same thing. Different sentence. Same consequence. William doesn't get angry. That's what makes it worse. He asks for a complete list. Every office. Every access arrangement. Every staffing designation. Every space allocation linked to the proposal. Not just Camilla's. All of them. Now everybody gets nervous. Because William has stopped correcting one clause. He's auditing the architecture. And when a future king starts asking what survives a reign, nobody can pretend it's about furniture anymore. If you've been following these palace battles with us, subscribe here, because this is exactly where the tiny details become bigger than the headlines. One sentence in a royal document can matter more than 100 photographs on a balcony. Then William sees the list, and something unexpected happens. Camilla's name isn't the biggest issue on it. Charles's is. Several arrangements are structured around the current sovereign's household, his working habits, his preferences, his residences, and the administrative systems built during his reign. That's normal. Of course it is. But now William sees the broader problem. If he objects only to Camilla's arrangement, it looks personal. If he objects to every unnecessary restriction on the next sovereign, it's constitutional housekeeping. So he changes strategy. He doesn't block Camilla. He blocks permanence itself. That distinction matters. Because suddenly, nobody can accuse him of singling out his stepmother without explaining why every other current reign arrangement should be protected too. The instruction becomes wider. All post-reign designations must return for review upon accession unless required by law, trust, ownership agreement, or established constitutional necessity. When the reign changes, the new monarch gets to decide. Now Camilla finally responds, but not the way people expect. No fury, No ultimatum. In this dramatized version, she asks a brutally simple question. Does that include Catherine? Oh, there it is. Because William has spent this entire time protecting the freedom of his own future reign. But Catherine will one day occupy the position Camilla holds now. Queen Consort. If William creates a principle limiting Camilla's ability to leave institutional arrangements behind, the same principle could eventually limit Catherine. That's the contradiction nobody saw coming. William can't demand one rule for Camilla and another for his wife without looking exactly like the thing he's trying not to be. So he answers, yes, one word, but that answer changes the story. Because now Camilla understands he's serious. This isn't an attempt to humiliate her. It's an attempt to stop any consort from creating obligations for the reign that follows, including Catherine. And strangely, that makes the decision harder to fight. Charles could object. Camilla could object. Staff could warn that constant restructuring creates instability. But William has found the cleanest possible argument. The crown must remain transferable, not frozen around the personality of whoever happens to occupy the palace today. And that raises another uncomfortable question. What else has been designed around Charles that William might eventually undo? You see where this becomes dangerous. Because once you establish the principle that the next reign gets a clean review, every assumption becomes vulnerable. Residences, staffing, ceremonial priorities, patronages, office locations, public access, even the emotional geography of the royal family. Who stands where? Who uses what entrance? Who gets a room? Who gets a house? Who keeps an office after a spouse dies? Monarchies can look grand from outside. Inside, they're partly a giant exercise in managing access. And nothing exposes family hierarchy faster than access. A key, a room, a car, a security detail, a seat at dinner, a place on a balcony, a name on a door. Each seems tiny, until somebody loses one. That's why the supposed block hits so hard. William doesn't need to order Camilla out of anything. He only needs to refuse to guarantee what comes later. Those are completely different acts. But emotionally, they can feel almost identical, because certainty is a privilege. And William has just removed certainty. Then Charles makes one last move. He asks whether the language could guarantee review rather than automatic termination. When the fighting ended, millions were dead. That sounds like compromise. William sees immediately why it matters. Automatic termination means everything ends unless he renews it. Automatic review means everything continues unless he ends it. Do you see it? Same people, same rooms, same transition, completely different burden. Under one system, William must actively preserve arrangements. Under the other, he must actively destroy them. And politically, emotionally, publicly, destroying something is much harder than simply choosing not to renew it. That's the clever part. The default decides who carries the blame. William wants the default set to freedom. Charles wants the default set to continuity. Neither position is absurd. That's what makes the clash so good. Charles sees continuity as stability. William sees continuity as inherited obligation. Camilla sees something more personal, legacy. Because after years spent becoming accepted within the institution, the prospect that her footprint could be reviewed immediately after Charles's reign would carry an emotional weight no policy language can hide. Think about the arc. For decades, Camilla was one of the most controversial people connected to the royal family. Then, she married Charles in 2005. Years passed. Public duties increased. Queen Elizabeth II said in 2022 that it was her sincere wish that Camilla should be known as Queen Consort when Charles became king. Then Charles acceded. Camilla was crowned beside him in 2023. From outsider to queen. That's an extraordinary transformation. So imagine reaching the peak of that journey only to discover that the future king is already making sure the institution can reset when your husband's reign ends. Even if William means nothing personal by it, how could it not feel personal? But here's the part almost everyone misses. William has his own emotional history attached to Camilla. His mother was Diana, Princess of Wales. That fact hangs over every William-Camilla headline, whether either of them wants it to or not. The public is tempted to turn every disagreement into Diana's son versus the woman who married Diana's former husband. It's irresistible. It's also far too simple, because William's strongest argument works only if he refuses to make it about Diana. The moment he says, "This is about my mother," he loses institutional ground. The moment he says, "This is about the next sovereign's freedom," the argument becomes much harder to dismiss. And apparently that is exactly why the revised proposal becomes almost impossible to attack. Camilla keeps her present role, her present duties, her current space, her current staff arrangements subject to existing authority. Nothing is dramatically ripped away, but nothing beyond the reign is guaranteed either. William doesn't take something from her. He refuses to promise it to the future. That's colder. Because there is no scene, no photograph, no slam door, no obvious victim. Just a date, accession. The moment the crown passes, the review begins. But then Catherine sees the wording, and she spots one final problem. Remember, the rule applies to her too. Imagine William has a long reign. Imagine Catherine develops major projects, institutions, staff systems, offices, archives, charitable initiatives tied closely to her role. Then one day their child succeeds William. Should everything Catherine built automatically fall into uncertainty? That's what William's rule could mean. So Catherine supposedly proposes a distinction. Personal privileges end. Institutional work doesn't have to. That's the missing piece. A room cannot belong permanently to a personality simply because they once used it. But an archive, charity partnership, educational program, or public-facing project can continue if it serves the institution. Now William has something better than a block. He has a test. Not who asked for this. Not, is this Camilla's? One question. Does this serve the crown or the person? That's brutal. Because anything that can only be justified by saying she wants it becomes vulnerable. But anything that demonstrably serves the monarchy, the public, or an ongoing institution has a reason to survive. Suddenly, the Consorts library itself passes easily. Educational use, public access, official audiences, those functions can continue. But a permanent personal claim? That's harder. The room stays. The purpose stays. The guaranteed ownership of that purpose does not. And there's the twist. William doesn't need to erase Camilla from the royal plan. He separates Camilla from the part of the plan that must survive her. That's far more consequential. Because now the same logic can be applied everywhere. To Charles, to William himself, to Catherine. To every royal household that comes next. The institution survives. Personal arrangements expire unless somebody can justify renewing them. Then comes the image that tells you exactly where the monarchy may be heading. Picture Buckingham Palace after the restoration work is complete. Tourists moving through sections once closed to them. State guests entering for banquets. Officials working upstairs. Ceremonies unfolding beneath chandeliers that have seen reign after reign. Charles isn't sleeping there. William may never sleep there either. Camilla may use a room that once carried one purpose and later carries another. Catherine may one day walk into the same building as Queen and change it again. That's monarchy. It looks permanent because the stone is permanent. But inside, everything moves. Titles, people, households, power, even the meaning of the rooms. Which is why the most important thing William supposedly blocked wasn't Camilla. It was the assumption that today's arrangement automatically owns tomorrow. And somewhere inside that enormous palace, One line disappears from one draft. No cameras, no balcony, no announcement, just empty space where somebody had tried to make the future certain. William looks at the revised page, then closes the folder. Because one day, the keys will change hands. But when they do, he intends to inherit the crown, not somebody else's instructions. And if you think that distinction changes everything, tell me below who you believe should decide what survives from one reign into the next. Because the most powerful royal decision may not be deciding what stays, it may be deciding what you're finally allowed to change.